hello, and welcome back to the 20 Years of Women on Boards podcast with me, Claire Braund, co-founder and CEO of WOB. Today, we're talking to Victoria Weeks, an accomplished non-executive director with experience across a diverse range of business sectors on major private and public sector organisations and, of course, ASX-listed companies. Victoria's board career commenced in 2008 and followed a very successful executive career in banking and financial services. As a passionate advocate for gender equality, Victoria was one of the founders of the Australian Gender Equality Council. Well, hello, Victoria.
Thanks, Claire. Lovely to be here.
So, Victoria, you migrated to Australia at the tender age of 2 and spent most of your formative and teenage years visiting your grandfather's farm on the south coast during school holidays. You later co-owned a property on the mid-north coast with your now ex-husband. So how did your rural background shape your leadership and board career, and what ties do you maintain to the bush?
Thanks, Claire. It's such a great question because it's something I've been reflecting on probably in more recent years about how it impacted my career. Of course, that time as a kid and a young adult in the countryside was just amazing, such an amazing experience. So I've always really, valued that. But as I think about it, I think things like just very practical and down to earth. I'm a pretty down to earth individual. Turn my hand to anything. Doesn't mean I'm going to be great at it, but I'll give it a go. And I think you have to be like that in the country. Plus, you do a lot of stuff, you've never done before. And, not that we were that remote, but, when you're on the land and dealing with situations, often things come up that are really unpredictable and you just deal with it. Sometimes a little bit scary when you talk about horses and big bulls in the paddock of the yards or something like that, and a bit messy, so you have to get dirty. And it's a real team. It's a team game, and so I think all those things really shaped who I am as a human and therefore impacted my career. And the other thing I'll say is my granddad was a formidable man. I think he was a wonderful grandfather. My mum would probably say he wasn't such a great father, but people learn. And as I, both that experience, but as I got older and a young adult, he'd love, and, quite a bit older with me than me, no longer with us, but he would love to talk about my career and what I was doing and the things he'd done, not just on the land. He was in the Second World War, so he was significant in the Army Reserve. He had business interests. And so that experience and relationship and interest in me, I think of, as have a really powerful impact on the things that I've done later.
Yeah. And your current ties, do you still go back?
Oh, yes.
You were on the Rural Land Protection Board for a while.
Yes, I was. So that was my first paid board, tiny as it was. It was lovely. So, yes, as you said in the intro, my ex and I, we were together then, bought a farm up the mid-north coast, which actually still reminded me, the land we had is very similar to the type of land, very hilly country that I spent time in as a kid. I'm not there anymore. We're ex, but we're great friends. So I go there whenever I want, which is lovely. And I kept my horses there for many years. And my brother, in fact, has a place just down the road from my ex. So it's all in the family. And whilst I don't get there as much as I would love to me, it's just, again, so grounding and almost sort of spiritual in terms of the difference you have to the city and the work that I do every day. So love it and always want to spend more time there.
As a farm and country girl myself, I resonate entirely with that moment when you're about 15 k's out and you wind down the window and the smell of the air in the car changes, and it is a very spiritual thing. I always say you take the 3 R's out of the country: responsibility, respect, and resilience, which you spoke to as well. So you graduated from UNSW, University of New South Wales, with degrees in commerce and law, and went on to a career in finance with executive roles at ASIC, Citibank and Westpac, before moving into board roles. So at what point did you realise the boardroom, not the C-suite, is where you wanted to have an impact?
Look, I think it was really that time as a senior executive at Westpac, and I worked, reported to the board and the board audit committee and the board risk committee, and I was in a sort of specialist risk role. And so I saw that combination. I saw great directors, actually, a fabulous board, including Carolyn Houston at the time, and how they brought their work experience into the sort of governance and the leadership of the organisation. So to me, the potential I saw, I thought, oh, that would be interesting. And I think, but the other key factor for me, and maybe as I reflect, it might have been too young. I'd tell women if the same age, don't go yet. But I really didn't want to keep specialising in financial services as a sole thing or risk. I wanted to go back, and earlier in my career I'd done investment banking, and as an investment banker you get to be involved in all sorts of industries, manufacturing industries, agricultural industries, mining. And so that variety of experience and health was what I really enjoyed. So I was trying to work out how do I use the experience I had from a strong governance perspective and risk management, but actually have a more strategic impact and selfishly get involved in other sectors other than just financial services. So that was the plan, and it's kind of worked out, but it was probably a bumpier ride than I originally thought.
Your first board role was the cure for brain cancer, and you took that on in 2008, which is the year you joined Women on Boards.
Yes.
Of course, it's just 2 days since the death of former Australian of the Year, Professor Richard Scolyer AO, from an aggressive brain tumour. So what are your reflections from serving on this board and the impact you were able to have?
Thanks. Again, another great question. At the time, it was a tiny board, a tiny organisation, fledgling, just starting to have an impact on a really critical area. And just by chance, actually a former colleague of mine said to me, oh, you'd be great, will you join? So I said, and of course, totally unpaid. I think it gave me such great experience. And sometimes it's not the big flashy ones that really give you that deep experience. But that was one of those ones. One, I think in terms of the impact, and it's not just me, it's a whole board and how an organisation evolves, it was really bringing it into a more professional governance sphere, still appropriate to its size, but it was very much around the kitchen table, and people who were passionate about brain cancer and finding a cure, which is, as we say, still really important. But how do we actually make it a more impactful, high-performance organisation to scale and have that, better governance framework? So I guess I did quite a bit of heavy lifting with some other board colleagues to make that happen. And that's also hard because it's hard for an organisation with such deep passion and connection also to change. That was part of it. The other aspect of it, and again, when you're talking about Richard, it taught me when you're on a board, you really have to understand both an organisation, its purpose, and kind of deeply understand what it does. So I certainly didn't know a lot about brain cancer. I didn't know a lot about medical and scientific research and that community and how it works. And that opened my eyes enormously about the complexity of being a charity in the scientific research sector. I learned a lot about brain cancer, and still is, has the most deaths as a cancer, and is still one of the most underfunded. And we were saying that, more than nearly 20 years ago, and it's still the case. It has changed enormously. So I think it was that, how do I really help shape it to that next phase, and then hand the baton to someone else. So I learned an awful lot of things, some tough lessons too, but it was really, really powerful. And when you're involved in an organisation like that, even though you can't fix everything miraculously quickly, these are hard problems, the satisfaction you get out of really helping a cause move forward through your role on a board, I think it's great.
So you now hold multiple board seats, and of course you did continue on healthcare boards as well, and across banking, as you would expect from your background, housing. As I said, you've done the Rural Lands Protection Board. Was it a deliberate strategy, or did your boards evolve organically?
A bit of both. As I often say to people when I'm talking about boards, like plan like crazy, work out what your strengths are, what you're interested in, and then see what happens. So sometimes the best plans in the world, and all your efforts don't necessarily work out. I had targeted health. It was just something I'd done some work in my investment banking career, some government and some private sector work around health, and it just fascinated me in terms of how my risk experience might play into that. But it's health is critical to all of us, so there was passion there. So that did work out. Again, the pathway is a little bit different to what I planned, but I've always had an element in my portfolio around health, medical research, and as I say, so interesting. I'd say the selfish part of it is like you really get to learn some amazing stuff that's so different from my executive career, and sometimes have a different perspective. So yeah, that bit worked out, although it's a kind of circuitous path, labyrinthine sometimes. Property had also been an area I was interested in, and the affordable housing piece I didn't know a lot about and hadn't thought about, but it kind of came out again, but bit by chance through a connection on one of the health boards. And then I saw through the health board, when I was on the big health district board, the connectivity between health and secure housing, and the reality of the difficulty we have and the unusual situation in this country where we don't have a lot of affordable housing. And by that, I mean not whether you can buy a house, I mean whether, rental housing and things like that. So that's absolutely critical. So yes, lots of planning, didn't always work out. I kind of wanted to get into energy and resources for a while, and it never happened, but that's okay. I've had a pretty full portfolio as it is.
So what's one thing they don't tell you about becoming a non-executive director that you had to learn the hard way?
I think most people tell you most things. It's probably what you hear when people say things or the experience of it. I think sometimes it's just a long, hard slog. It's certainly not as glamorous as sometimes it's made out to be. That doesn't mean it's not great and satisfying in many respects. Things always happen a little bit slower than you think often. The things you want to change and do good, then the bad things can happen very quickly and take you by surprise. So I think overall, I think part of the piece is for me, and not all directors get this experience, is the humility you need. You really need to kind of forget the ego, work hard, bring your skills there, and through the good and the bad, I think, and that's what helps get you through. But probably the criticality of that I had never fully appreciated when I was embarking on this journey.
So you've led organisations through strategic issues management and transformational change, both executive and a board level. What do you think is the difference between a board that handles a crisis well and one that makes it worse?
I think when it's handled well is when you see that board really come together and stay tight. Now, that doesn't mean you're agreeing on everything, because you're often dealing with some really hard situations, so you have to have hard conversations, but the loyalty and the cohesiveness to me, and when it doesn't work, you can see people, I was going to say panicking, and that's true, panic a bit. I've panicked a bit, but, you kind of panic and then reset. You don't necessarily panic and go and do unpredictable things or try and, splinter groups and things like that. So, and sometimes it's really hard to predict how people react under pressure and the sort of pressure, because sometimes, even though we're not executives, boards nowadays, particularly on listed company boards and highly regulated boards, you are in the hot seat. And the reality is sometimes when things go wrong, even though you've done your job as well as you can and quite well, you can kind of be the part of the problem or the target. And so that's very confronting. And so what you see in those situations sometimes is individual board members who haven't come to terms with the reality of that and the possible consequences, which aren't nice. But if you haven't kind of accepted that, sometime I might have to go. When a crisis happens, I think sometimes you don't react in as constructive a way as you might. And I say that from experience and saying it's hard. It's really hard sometimes to kind of keep that calm in difficulties, stress. But I think it's that when you see boards come together, rather than the kind of tension or the pulling, is is when you know kind of you're going to be okay whatever happens.
Yeah, when the team forms and really starts to work
it's
together
about
well.
team. Yeah.
So when you walk into a boardroom or you've been invited onto a board and you sense something is off with the culture, what are the tells?
That's such a great question. I think sometimes it's the little things, or sometimes even it's the hygiene things, which I call board hygiene, which sometimes can not be a big deal, but sometimes kind of just body language, how people talk to each other, both management and a board or board members. So it's kind of little things. Then when I say the board hygiene, I remember once on my LHPA board where whole new board, everyone walked in the room as a new person on day one. This was what I call the state board. There was a region board. So that was hard. So we were all, some of the people knew each other already. I didn't because I wasn't sort of part of the whole sector at the time, but kind of forming and storing. But I think over time where you see people really not as respectful, a bit loose with their language, whether it's to management or each other, when people talk about, and I've seen both execs and board members to do this, when I've joined an organisation, I always say we. I'm not saying that's perfect. And I once was like, at Westpac, we did this. And when people use language where they talk about the organisation almost as a third party, I always worry about that. It's funny. It's a very little thing. So but some hygiene factors where you go, oh, this report was late or it's always late. And you're going, nah, something's not right with that. That shouldn't happen. So it's actually just the little things, to be honest.
So with that in mind, what's the board conversation that Australian business isn't having loudly enough right now?
Do you know that's the hardest question you asked? That's a great question. And the reason I say that is because if people are expecting the answer like cyber or AI, certainly on boards I'm on, that's part of the conversation every day. It doesn't mean we're doing it perfectly, but it is absolutely deeply already part of the conversation. So when I think about that question, I think, well, what is something that we're actually, even though we're all over some of the big issues that we're facing into, even though they might be, the hard stuff might be a year or two away, there's two aspects to it. The first one is, our board's really designed to do the job we want them to do. Sometimes I stop and think about that, have we made any difference at all? And how we operate. It's a really interesting one. And the other dimension to that is, and it's funny, I've through a few of my boards just recently done the usual annual board performance review process, and it comes up with some questions. And often when you talk to directors, just the board, about what we could do better, very quickly the conversation talks about what management's doing, not about us. It's kind of interesting. I'm not saying I'm perfect either, but it's really interesting how we really struggle to actually go, I think we should talk to each other differently. I think, we talk too much or we don't listen, or, it's really interesting. So I think that true reflection, but that builds into a broader question, is the design of boards, and it's not next year, whatever, but I do wonder about the whole construct, about whether it's the best way. I don't have the answer, but I think deeply thinking about it, we rely on it for really good governance and good risk management and strategy, but sometimes I wonder if we did some parallel testing, stuck management in there to do what they did, took the board away, as long as you got the right management, would the outcome be any different? Isn't that a terrible thing to say? I like to think we do, but I think we all should always challenge ourselves on that because we create a lot of work too, right?
Yeah. There is a lot of work, and there's a lot of work, there's a lot of regulation, and it seems to be sheeting back up to the governance space, particularly in that social care sector.
Yes. Well, all sectors, and I think in what we talked about before about when boards are more effective or not, and sometimes when there's a crisis, how they react. Sometimes boards have to get more involved, but sometimes just the work that gets created because of that tension around the board and their, the existential threat often to individuals and boards, particularly in the listed sector, but the highly regulated sector, but as you say, the social care sector too, sometimes we can be our own worst enemy, I think.
You were a founder of the Australian Gender Equality Council and a former chair. So what does success look like for gender equality, or equity as I often prefer to say, in Australian boardrooms? And are we on track to get there across all sectors?
Well, to me, equality at its simplest, and it's just one dimension, is on average 50% women. I know we have 40-40-20, and that makes actually perfect sense, totally understand it, but 50% women, because if we use that as a kind of hard line, and we're certainly not there yet. Are we on track? I think we are, but it is not a foregone conclusion by any means. If we look at, and I know diversity is broader than gender, but just that for a moment. But if we look at the progress, it's so easy to go, wow, 2008-9, when I was starting out, I think it was something horrific, like 8%, and we all went wild, and it had its effect, right? Good. And I've been partly a beneficiary of that. But still 38% or averaging 38% for the ASX 200, so that's the highest, and that's just one test, is still fragile. And I think if we are genuine and saying, well, 30 or 40% women in any sector, whether it's exempt, is enough, why? So I think we're on the right track. I think we need to continue to work incredibly hard in different ways and constantly think about it and challenge. And that means also passing the baton to others, because a few of us kind of feel exhausted, as I imagine, the suffragettes did in, different phases of feminism. We cannot stop now because I think it's fragile. So yes, on the right track, but it is a precious achievement and we have to keep going. The other thing is, and I include myself in this cohort, but still on the most powerful boards and largest boards, and even if you go ASX 200, 300 and the big charities and the big unlisted and all of that, you will have a certain cohort of women. I like to think of myself as down to earth and all those things, but I still, frankly, come from a degree of privilege. And I worry that we still need the next generation, and we have to be very careful not to just say this is the group and we'll keep going with that group. We have to keep expanding, and that means also expanding our perception of what diversity is, age, culture, everything, and really challenging ourselves if we want truly dynamic boards that reflect the community. So I just think it's really important not to go, hey, we've improved enormously, but that's not enough. It's not really where we want to be, in my view.
It's a really good point. And, of course, there's the whole issue around First Nations and cultural diversity, particularly the latter one, on boards, yes, which we don't do particularly well. It's interesting you speak to the fact that, we don't want to replace the sort of old boys club with the new women's club. That wasn't quite the purpose.
Exactly.
That doesn't. Yeah. It's a difficult one. You've been a WOB member for many years, thank you. And in that time, as we've discussed, your board career has totally taken off. In fact, it was almost in parallel. So looking back on your journey, how important has WOB been to you and to that journey?
Oh, look, amazingly important. I have to say that, don't I, Claire? But I do genuinely mean it. What I've loved about it, and you guys would go and break guns by the time I got involved, but what I do love about it, it's sort of been, in parallel, but also symbiotic. It's like, for me, it created a community. It gave me access to a group of women directors who were just starting out. It gave me some basics, like how to turn your ridiculously long executive CV into a board CV, access to board opportunities and that incredible community. So for me, that was great. It also gave me a wonderful organisation, as you know, whether it's through the work with FinCEA and then the Gender Equality Council. We did some fun stuff together, and one was to me always very impressive, because you took risks and faced into, in a very respectful way, but just made some calls. Was the traffic light report, and didn't over-engineer it, which really got the business community's attention. So it was such a joy to see that evolve and WOB's role evolve, and also just the incredible work you do in terms of supporting women directors and the range of programs that you have that I've loved being involved in as well. So absolutely fantastic. And every time I meet an aspiring woman director, I say, the first thing you have to do is join WOB.
That's very kind of you. Thank you. Tell me, though, as the number of women on boards continues to grow, and of course we are mindful that we have to keep our eye on the ball in terms of, make sure that 40% is across all sector and it holds. When WOB enters its next decade, what do you see as the next frontier? We touched on it a bit in the question but one when we talked about the Gender Equality Council, but is it chairs or what do you think is the next big frontier?
Well, in one aspect before the next big frontier or something different is just keep doing what you're doing and more of it, to be honest. And I know that part of that sounds very boring. Obviously, you have to reinvent and how you connect with people. But to me, it's just more and scale, because that's what we need. And we need a really large community of women putting themselves up on boards. But your question prompted me to look again at some of the current stats. I do think, again, if you look at the variety, some boards have 60 or 70% women, which is yay. The boys have been doing that for years. It's time we can do that. But then others that don't. So I think looking at sectors, and it applies in the exec context as well, as well as the board context. I do think chairs, that's very interesting. That's been very sticky. I think it's around 13% with it's 200. And it's an interesting one because being a chair, particularly of those big ASX listed companies, gosh, you have to be brave and prepared to take on what is honestly like a CEO role in many respects. And I'm not saying women can't do it. They absolutely can. But that preparedness and willingness to throw yourself into the fire or the bullpen. So I think both supporting women and making that something they want to do, not feel they should do for the sisterhood. So I think chairs piece is important. I think the sector piece is important because when you look, as you go down the ranks and you look at the companies, interesting, tech, mining, we need to break that one in the small mining companies. MedTech, interestingly, has a very small number of women on the board. So I think looking at the sectors, but I think as you have done, as WOB has done, bringing the exec perspective into it, because they are connected. There is a connection there in terms of equality in that sector without losing your core purpose. And I think always that that intersection piece, whether it's, First Nations or other cultural backgrounds, I do find it interesting, although we're more likely to see men of other cultural backgrounds, not the big numbers, but still more likely to see men of other cultural backgrounds than women of other cultural backgrounds, which is kind of interesting. So I think constantly pushing into that and supporting that in the way we should, I think will also help, because that broadens the kind of the pool and the community of women who want to do this and are successful at doing this.
And final question. What are 3 words that you would use to sum up your journey over the past 20 years?
Now, I know that was a trick question because Claire, I'm not good at being brief.
3 phrases.
I think adventure, what's that? Courage, it all sounds negative, and joy, actually. Those 3 things. So it's a real mix, but it is an adventure.
Adventure, courage and joy. I like that. Virginia, thank you very much. Oh, sorry, Victoria, thank you very much for joining me on the podcast today.
My absolute pleasure, Claire. It's been a joy.